Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the sound of an old wooden ship drifting through a sea as black as ink. The boards creak softly beneath your feet. A lantern sways on its chain, and the wind slips through the rigging like a whisper that never ends. The air is so cold your breath turns white before your eyes, the kind of cold that bites, not gently, but like a living thing. And somewhere out here in this endless frozen dark, men once tried to sleep. Not in beds or cabins, but on bare planks, wrapped in damp wool and dreams that could barely keep the cold away. Tonight we're going to find out how they did it, how pirates survived the freezing nights at sea and somehow lived long enough to see another dawn. This is not the Caribbean of sun-bleached decks and lazy waves. This is an older sea, the North Atlantic, the Baltic, the Channel where winter turns water to glass and frost climbs the ropes like ivy. These were the roots of the medieval pirates, men who hunted merchant ships not under tropical moons but beneath skies heavy with snow. They stole gold, grain and fur, but the real treasure was warmth. A blanket that wasn't soaked, a fire that didn't die, a night when no one froze before morning. History remembers their battles and their flags, but it rarely speaks of their nights, of the quiet hours when even the bravest turned small and human before the cold. It begins on a night without stars. The sea is calm, yet the cold moves through the air like smoke. You walk across the deck of a pirate ship, the planks hard with frost, each step giving a brittle crack beneath your boots. The sails above hang stiff and heavy, glittering faintly where ice has formed along the seams. A lantern near the mast swings gently, its light pale and uncertain, stretching long shadows over the sleeping ropes. The air smells of salt and tar, and something sour like old wool left too long in the rain. Somewhere below deck a man coughs, deep and wet, followed by a low voice muttering a prayer to Saint Elmo, the sailor's patron of lightning and lost hope. Another groans, turning in his hammock. The sound of the ship is constant, never still. The sigh of the timbers, the thump of ropes, the faint slap of water against the hull. To live here is to live inside a heartbeat made of wood and wind. You pause by the railing, your fingers sticking briefly to the frozen metal. Beyond it, the sea glimmers like dark glass, the waves slow and thick with slush. Somewhere out there are ports sealed by ice and fishermen stranded ashore, but not here. Here, there is only motion, slow, endless, necessary. The pirates sleep where they can, between barrels, on coils of rope, in narrow hammocks that sway with the ship. Their blankets are thin, their breath clouds the air, and their dreams, if they come at all, are short and cold. They rub their hands with whale oil before bed, a trick learned from northern whalers. It traps heat under the skin, thick and greasy, smelling of death but keeping life inside. They sleep in boots, cloaks, anything that still holds warmth. To undress would be madness. The sea shows no mercy to skin. A man who sleeps too deeply may never wake, not because of a storm or blade, but because the cold has crept into his blood. Above you, the sails moan softly, and the frost on the ropes catches the lantern light like stars trapped in ice. You realize that on this ship, sleep is not rest. It's surrender. Each hour stolen from the cold is a small victory, a defiance whispered against the endless winter sea. The truth is that pirates did not sleep so much as collapse, bodies giving in to exhaustion after endless hours of hauling ropes, bailing water, and standing watch against the wind. The ship never stopped moving, and neither did they. Even when the sea was calm, the deck tilted with a slow, deliberate rhythm that turned rest into something half real, like drifting between two worlds. Imagine lying down on cold planks that never stop swaying, the boards beneath you damp from sea spray, the air thick with salt and smoke and unwashed bodies. You pull your blanket tighter, but it smells of tar and mildew, and the chill finds you anyway. Pirates in the medieval North were not the silk-coated rogues of storybooks. They were labourers of violence, sleeping in their clothes, their weapons tied to their belts even as they dozed. A cutlass could be a pillow, a pistol, a nightlight. In these cramped quarters, men learned to rest with one eye half open, trained by years of raids and betrayal. The sea was not their only enemy. Sometimes it was the man sleeping inches away. Trust froze faster than water. Below deck, hammocks hung in thick rows, packed so close that a man could reach out and touch two others without moving. The air down there was warmer than above, but only because it was crowded and foul. Breath turned the air wet and heavy, condensation dripping from the beams like rain. The wood swelled from the moisture. Everything smelled of salt, sweat, and the faint rot of wool that never dried. Yet to these men that heat, stifling, sour, human meant survival. Historians describe this part of a ship as the belly, and the name fits. It was alive, beating and groaning with the movement of the waves. The sound of snoring, coughing, muttered dreams. Hammocks swayed in a slow, synchronized rhythm, and the sound of them creaking together was like the pulse of a sleeping beast. The pirates didn't complain. They learned to love that sound. It meant the ship was still whole, that they hadn't hit ice or rock in the dark. Silence on a ship like this was far worse. Silence meant death. When the cold became unbearable, men slept in clusters, wrapping themselves in stolen sailcloth, or sharing one blanket between three. They'd sleep back to back, exchanging warmth through their spines, too proud to admit it was the only way to keep their hearts from slowing. There was no shame in it. The sea stripped that away long ago. A few ships even kept small iron pots filled with heated stones, sealed with cloth, and passed from man to man before they slept. The ship's fragile version of a hearth. If the pot cooled too soon, it was said to bring bad luck. Above deck, the men on watch fought to stay awake, stamping their boots and rubbing their hands until the skin cracked. They sang softly to keep time, half songs, half prayers, their voices carried away by the wind before anyone could remember the words. Some historians think these murmurs were less about keeping rhythm and more about sanity. When you stand on a frozen sea long enough, surrounded by blackness and the endless creak of wood, you start to hear things that aren't there. Voices in the waves, footsteps on the planks, the sea talking back. And so, sleep became both refuge and risk. Too little of it, and madness crept in. Too much, and you might never wake. The line between rest and death blurred. A man could drift off dreaming of a warm shore, and wake to find his toes gone to frostbite. They said the sea didn't kill you all at once. She took you one piece at a time. Every pirate developed his own ritual for sleeping through the cold. Some muttered the same words before closing their eyes, scraps of psalms or curses whispered into the dark. Others tied small charms above their hammocks, carved bits of bone, shells, coins, anything to ward off the cold and the spirits that came with it. One captain's log mentions a crewman who refused to sleep until he had drawn a cross on the beam above him each night, using soot from the galley fire. He said it kept the sea from counting his breath. Still, despite the filth and fear, there was a strange comfort in that closeness. The ship became a single body, each man a heartbeat, each hammock a lung. When one shifted, the others swayed. When one dreamt, the sound rippled through them all. The ocean roared outside, ancient and cold, but down here, in the belly of the ship, the pirates created a small defiance, a world where the living clung to each other for warmth, and where even the frozen sea could not quite reach them. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it now. The slow rhythm of wood, breath, and sleep blending into the deep hum of the ocean. For men like these, that was the closest thing to peace they would ever know. When dawn came, it was not bright or golden, but grey, a thin light that felt tired before it even reached the deck. The pirates woke stiff and slow, their joints aching, breath steaming in the cold air. Some stretched, some cursed softly under their breath, and others just sat in silence, blinking at the horizon that barely existed through the mist. The ship groaned around them like an old creature waking from restless sleep. Above, the rigging was coated in frost again, the ropes so stiff they looked carved from bone. Every movement was deliberate. Every sound seemed too loud against the stillness of the sea. They had survived another night, and that alone was reason enough to keep going. Survival was the only rhythm pirates truly understood. The first task of the morning was always to beat the ice off the ship, an endless chore that began before breakfast and ended only when the sun climbed high enough to soften the frost, which in winter rarely happened at all. Men took hammers, mallets, or the backs of their knives and struck the frozen ropes until shards of ice fell like shattered glass. Their hands bled freely, but they laughed through it because laughter warmed faster than silence. The deck turned slick with splinters of frost sparkling faintly in the weak light, as if the ship had been dusted with broken stars. Food came next, though calling it food was generous. The cook, if you could call him that, stood over a small iron stove, its embers nearly dead. He boiled whatever rations were left: salted beef, hardtack biscuits, a few spoons of oatmeal if they were lucky. The air filled with the smell of brine, smoke, and something sour that clung to the back of the throat. Men gathered around, holding tin cups close to the heat, letting the steam rise into their faces like a blessing. Old ship records describe mornings like this as grey hours, time suspended between the night's cold and the day's labour. Pirates didn't eat for pleasure. They ate for fuel. They sat shoulder to shoulder, hands trembling from the cold, sharing whatever warmth their bodies still had left. Sometimes they softened their bread by soaking it in rum, letting the sharp alcohol sting their tongues awake. Better than nothing. One pirate had written in a crude log, later found on a wreck, but not by much. After eating, the men checked the hammocks, shaking out the ones frozen stiff with condensation. The fabric cracked in their hands, hard as sailcloth. They would hang them up near the galley fire to thaw, the air briefly filling with the scent of wet rope and smoke. It wasn't pleasant, but it was proof that they were still alive, still moving. A frozen hammock meant death waiting in silence. The captain would appear by mid-morning, wrapped in layers of wool and leather, his face pale, eyes sunken from a night spent half awake. Leadership on a frozen ship was a heavy thing. He was expected to command, to navigate, to keep the men working, and somehow to make them believe there was still a destination ahead. Most pirates had no map beyond the next raid, no promise of land that wasn't already hostile. Their compass was hunger, and their god was chance. The cold made tempers short. A careless word could start a fight that ended with blood on the planks. Yet, just as often, those same men would share a blanket or a flask of grog an hour later. Out here, rage burned as quickly as frost formed. They depended on each other too much to hold grudges long. By midday, the sea began to shift again. Thin plates of ice clinked softly against the hull, and the horizon blurred into a pale smear of white and grey. The wind carried the sound of distant cracking, ice fields shifting, alive and unseen. Every man froze at that sound. Ice could crush a ship faster than any storm. Some prayed under their breath. Others spat on the deck for luck. The ship's cat, a small grey creature with frost on its whiskers, slinked along the rail, tail twitching. The men watched it as if it could sense danger before they could. On more than one voyage, sailors swore that when the cat hissed at the sea, a storm would follow. For now there was only stillness. The pirates worked quietly, scraping ice, checking ropes and stamping their feet to stay warm. Their breaths rose like smoke signals in the air, and somewhere beneath that silence, beneath the dull clatter of tools and the groan of the hull, was the same unspoken truth. They were at the mercy of the sea. They always had been. When night came again, it would all begin anew. The search for warmth, the struggle for sleep, the long hours of waiting while the ocean dreamed around them. But for now, the ship pressed forward through the frozen mist, carrying its shivering legends toward another unknowable dawn. The fourth night was colder than any before it. The wind had changed, sliding down from the north like a living blade. The sea, once restless and grey, had gone still and black, a mirror of frozen ink. The pirates spoke little now. Even laughter cost too much energy. Their breath hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Above, the sails strained and cracked softly where frost had stiffened them into shapes that no longer moved with the wind. Every sound carried through the ship: the groan of timbers, the creak of rope, the occasional muffled cough from below deck. When the weather turned this brutal, the pirates stopped pretending they could keep warm. Their world shrank to small acts of endurance. They layered whatever scraps they had: stolen wool, rags, even torn canvas, wrapping themselves until they looked more like ghosts than men. They rubbed whale oil or seal fat onto their faces and hands, an old northern trick to stop the skin from splitting open. The smell was unbearable, a mixture of rot and salt, but it saved fingers and ears from blackening in the frost. Below deck, the hammock swung slower tonight. The men barely spoke. Their breaths made faint halos in the cold air, rising toward the low beams where droplets of ice had formed like glass beads. The lantern burned weakly, its light flickering as if shivering itself. Someone muttered that the oil was freezing in the wick, a bad sign. Light and warmth were failing together. In this kind of cold, sleep became dangerous. A man could close his eyes for rest and wake no more, so they took turns watching each other. 2 men awake for every 6 asleep. That was the rule when the sea froze. The watchers would walk the length of the deck, shaking shoulders gently, making sure the living stayed that way. It wasn't kindness, it was necessity. The dead took warmth with them, and on a ship this small that meant death for everyone. An account from a captured privateer tells of crews tying thin cords around their wrists before sleep, the other end tied to a waking man's belt. If one stopped moving, if breathing slowed too long, the tug on the cord would wake the other. You can picture it now, a web of thin strings stretching through the dark, the fragile thread between life and silence. The pirates on this ship might not have used the same trick, but they lived by the same instinct. No one slept alone if they could help it. Above deck, the world was worse. Ice had built thick on the railings and ropes, making every step a gamble. The moon hung low and white, painting the ship in a light that looked more like bone than silver. You could hear the ice shifting along the hull, cracking softly like distant thunder. Men said the sea groaned when it was about to break, that she warned those who listened. Tonight, the groaning never stopped. The helmsman stood at his post, wrapped in furs stolen from a merchant vessel months ago. His hands, gloved but shaking, clung to the wheel. Frost had gathered on his beard, turning him pale as the moonlight itself. Every so often he stamped his boots, but it did little good. The cold had climbed into the wood, into the ropes, into the very bones of the ship. You could almost hear it settling in. And then came the whispering, that strange sound sailors swore was real. The wind, when thin enough, passed through the rigging and made voices, high, soft, human voices. They rose and fell with the waves, sometimes laughing, sometimes sighing. A few men believed it was the ocean calling them, the ghosts of those who'd frozen before. Others said it was only the wind, though no one truly believed that. Even the captain, hardened and silent, refused to look up when the sound came. It is in moments like this, the middle of the night when the world feels hollow, that you understand how close these men lived to madness. Cold strips away more than warmth. It strips away reason. Sleep deprived, half frozen, surrounded by endless dark, pirates often slipped into a strange rhythm of hallucination and prayer. Some swore they saw lights in the water, like lanterns glowing beneath the ice. Others claimed to see figures walking on the surface of the sea, their faces pale and familiar, dead shipmates, come to remind them what waited if they stopped fighting. Historians reading the surviving journals call these frost visions born of exhaustion and hypothermia, but to the men who lived them they were real. Reality blurred easily when the air burned your lungs and the horizon no longer existed. Inside, the pirates huddled closer. The cat curled on a coil of rope, its fur puffed against the chill, eyes glowing in the dim light. One man whispered an old prayer, not to God, but to the sea, asking her to sleep gently tonight. Another laughed weakly and offered his rum flask to anyone awake enough to take it. The liquid burned like fire, false warmth spreading just long enough to trick the body into forgetting its fear. Outside, snow began to fall. The flakes drifted sideways, caught in the wind, landing softly on the deck before melting into nothing. The pirates watched them from the hatch, silent, as if afraid to disturb the quiet beauty of it. For a brief moment, the sea looked peaceful, endless, still, eternal, the kind of peace that hides teeth. And as the snow fell thicker, covering the frozen ropes and the tired men in pale dust, you realize something simple and terrible. No one ever conquered the sea. They just learned how to endure her, one shivering night at a time. By the fifth night, the sea had grown restless. The air no longer lay still, and the wind carried a low, moaning hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once, through the rigging, across the planks, inside the men's bones. The snow had stopped, but the sky remained swollen with dark clouds thick as smoke. The pirates could feel the change long before it began. Old sailors said you could smell a storm before you saw it, that the salt turned sour, and the air grew heavy, as if the sea itself were holding its breath. Tonight, it smelled like iron. The captain stood at the helm, his hands trembling against the frozen wheel. Around him, the crew moved with a silent urgency born of habit. They tightened ropes, checked sails, and lashed down barrels before the wind could take them. No one spoke. The cat disappeared somewhere below deck, an omen that made every man's stomach twist. You didn't need superstition to know what was coming. The sea was already speaking. Then it began, not with thunder or lightning, but with sound. A low groan that rolled beneath the waves, deep and long, as if the ocean was waking. The next moment the wind struck like a whip, sharp and cold, slamming into the sails with a violent crack. The ship shuddered, the timbers screaming in protest. Frost shattered from the rigging like shards of glass. The lanterns went out one by one. Darkness swallowed the deck. The pirates fought to hold the ropes, their hands burning where the ice cut through the skin. Every breath hurt, each gust stealing warmth straight from their lungs. The world became a blur of movement, men shouting over the roar of wind, the sails snapping, the hull rising and crashing with each new wave. Water sprayed across the deck, freezing almost instantly into glassy sheets that made footing impossible. A man slipped, hit the planks, and vanished over the side before anyone could shout his name. No one followed him. There was no point. In seas like this, a fall meant death in seconds. Below deck, the rest of the crew clung to anything they could find, ropes, beams, barrels. As the ship pitched violently from side to side, the hammocks swung like pendulums, slamming against each other. The noise was unbearable, wood cracking, waves pounding, the muffled screams of men trying to hold on. The air smelled of salt, sweat, and fear. Somewhere in the chaos, a barrel broke loose, rolling across the floor until it pinned a man against the wall. The sound of his cry cut through the storm for only a moment before the next crash drowned it out. And yet, amid all this terror, the strangest thing happened. Men began to laugh. Ragged, wild laughter that came not from joy, but from defiance. When the world shrinks to noise and motion and cold, laughter becomes a weapon. One pirate shouted above the roar, "If she means to take us, let her do it with music." Another joined him, singing a broken sea shanty between bursts of coughing. The sound rose and fell like a dying heartbeat. Human, stubborn, absurdly brave. Historians later wrote about this kind of madness. Sailors laughing in storms, singing when they should have prayed. It wasn't courage. Not really. It was the only way to keep fear from taking full shape. As long as they could sing, they were still alive. Hours passed. The storm did not ease. Water poured through the cracks, flooding the lower deck until it reached their knees. The men worked by feel alone, hauling buckets, patching leaks, shouting hoarse commands. The lanterns had all gone out, and the only light came from lightning flashing through the gaps in the hull. brief, ghostly glimpses of faces twisted in exhaustion. The captain's voice rose once in the chaos, sharp as steel. "Hold her steady," but even his command was lost in the wind. It is hard to imagine what sleep meant in such a night. Yet some tried. Between the worst waves, men slumped where they stood, eyes half open, dreaming in fragments. One leaned against the mast, snoring softly even as water dripped from his hair. Another sat cross-legged beside a leaking barrel, hands still clutching a rope, head bowed as if in prayer. They didn't rest by choice. They simply ran out of strength. And somehow, through all the screaming and crashing, the ship endured. Wooden bones creaked, ropes snapped and were replaced, and men moved with the rhythm of survival. They had become part of the storm, their movements sinking with the sea's rage until they no longer fought it. They floated with it. Toward dawn, the worst began to fade. The wind weakened first, the waves shrinking to long, rolling swells. The deck was slick with ice and blood. The survivors moved slowly, dazed, counting faces, saying names. They found the missing ones by their absence. No words were spoken for them. On ships like this, grief came later, if at all. The cat returned first, crawling from a pile of rope with a small, tired meow. One man laughed softly, almost a sob. "She's still floating," he said, meaning the ship, not the cat. The rest nodded. That was enough. The storm had tested them, and somehow they had passed. When the sun rose at last, pale, distant, and cold, it lit the ship like an artifact half buried in frost. The sails hung torn but upright. The men moved slowly, repairing what they could, their bodies stiff, their faces hollow. No one spoke of the lost. No one mentioned how close the sea had come to winning. Instead, they worked in silence. And when night came again, they slept, not peacefully, not deeply, but together, in damp hammocks and wet clothes, with the ship's groans as their lullaby. For all their sins and savagery, the pirates of these frozen seas understood one sacred truth: the storm always ends, but the cold never does. And so they slept, clutching what warmth they could, grateful for a night that did not try to kill them. Morning came without ceremony, like a grey cloth drawn over the world. The storm had passed, but its weight still lingered in the air, heavy, damp, and strangely quiet. The ship floated on a sea that looked bruised, its surface littered with debris, splintered wood, scraps of rope, a broken oar drifting past like a ghost. Every breath felt slow now, as though even the wind was recovering from exhaustion. The pirates moved carefully, each one slower than the last. Their faces were hollow, their eyes raw from salt and sleeplessness. No one spoke above a whisper. The deck was slick with frozen seawater, glinting faintly under a pale sky that offered light but no warmth. One man swept the ice away with the stiff bristles of an old broom, each stroke brittle and final. Another knelt beside a broken plank, his hands red from cold as he hammered a patch of wood into place. The sound of each nail echoed across the deck like a heartbeat returning after too long a silence. Below deck, the damage was worse. Water had pooled ankle deep, turning the air sour and thick. Men wrung out blankets, hung them near the small galley fire to dry, and prayed the ship would hold. The hammocks dripped steadily, dark stains spreading across the floorboards. The cat prowled through the mess, tail twitching, sniffing at the puddles and curling around the legs of whoever stood still long enough. It was as if she was counting the living. No one mentioned the missing. Their names had already sunk beneath the waves. Survivors at sea often wrote that the hours after a storm were the most dangerous, not because of weather, but because of silence. The sea would fall still, too still, and men would begin to hear the faint creaks and sighs of the ship as something almost human, as if the vessel itself were breathing. In that stillness, thoughts returned. Memory, guilt, fear, things the storm had kept away. You can see it now, the captain standing near the bow, his coat torn, his beard crusted with salt, staring into the flat horizon where the sky meets the water like a dull blade. His shoulders slump for just a moment before he straightens again. He doesn't pray, doesn't curse. He just breathes slow and steady and taps his thumb against the frozen wood of the railing, as though checking to make sure it's real. The men work quietly around him. They repair ropes, mend torn sails, check barrels for leaks. One hums a song under his breath, the same tune they sang before the storm, only slower now, the melody softened into something like mourning. It spreads through the crew, low and fragile, until the entire deck seems to hum along. The creak of the mast, the thud of hammers, the shuffle of boots. The sea listens, calm and cold, offering no reply. By midday, a faint sun slips through the clouds. The light is thin but golden, turning the frost on the ropes into tiny threads of fire. The pirates pause for a moment to look. No one says it aloud, but that glow, fleeting as it is, feels like mercy. A man lifts his face to the warmth, closes his eyes and smiles faintly, as if remembering something distant and gentle. Historians who study northern voyages write about this moment. The quiet after chaos as a kind of spiritual rebirth. Men who survived storms often spoke of it as though waking from death. For a few precious hours, the sea forgets her cruelty. Even the cold feels softer, the air cleaner, the world less indifferent. The pirates feel it too. You can see it in their posture, the way their shoulders loosen. Their laughter returns in small, uncertain bursts. They share what's left of their rum, passing the flask from hand to hand. It burns, but it also binds, a reminder that they are still here, still capable of warmth. The cat perches near the galley, licking her paw, her fur glinting in the sun. Someone jokes that she must be the real captain now. The laughter that follows is thin but real, fragile as the ice melting beneath their boots. Below deck, the hammocks sway gently again, cleaner now, their salt-stiff fabric softening as the air warms slightly. A few men lie down, not to sleep, but to close their eyes for a moment. Their bodies rock with the rhythm of the ship, that slow, steady breathing of the ocean returning to normal. You can almost hear the sighs of the exhausted wood, the murmur of men slipping into dreamless rest. And though the cold has not gone, it feels different now. Familiar, manageable, almost kind. The sea is never kind, but it does not always hate. As evening falls, the sky clears entirely for the first time in days. The horizon glows faintly orange, the waves reflecting its light in small ripples of fire. The pirates gather on deck, silent again, watching the sunset as though it were a rare treasure. None of them speak. They just stand there, side by side, faces lit by the dying sun. Somewhere below, water drips slowly into a bucket, a reminder that the sea still watches, still waits. But for now, the ship holds steady. The storm is behind them, the night is coming, and the cold is returning to its quiet throne. Yet tonight, when the pirates finally close their eyes, they will not dream of frost or death. They will dream of warmth, of sunlight on water, of stillness without fear. And in that fragile dream, for just a few hours, the frozen sea will sleep with them. Night returned like a memory, quiet, heavy, and wide as the ocean itself. But this time the darkness felt different. The cold was still there, curling through the seams of the ship, sliding over the men's faces as they worked or rested. Yet it no longer seemed to press against their hearts. The storm had burned something out of them. Fear, perhaps, or the illusion that they could ever fight the sea. What remained was smaller, humbler, but stronger too. Below deck, the men gathered close around the dim lantern that hung from a beam. Its glow was weak and yellow, breathing in and out with every sway of the ship. The hammocks no longer moved in chaos, but in rhythm, their gentle rocking a lullaby that the pirates had long ago learned to trust. They spoke softly now, voices hoarse from salt and shouting, not about death, not about the ones they had lost, but about everything that helped them remember they were alive. Stories. Every ship had them. Tales traded like coins between watchers passed from mouth to mouth until no one remembered who had told them first. Some stories were lies, others half-truths, and a few, the oldest, might have been real once. The pirates told them not to boast, but to keep the dark from growing too loud. One man began with a story of a sailor who claimed he'd seen the edge of the world where the sea poured off into the stars. Another told of a ghost ship that sailed forever north, crewed by men of ice who never aged. A third swore he'd once slept through a storm so fierce that it tore the nails from the ship. Yet he dreamed of sunlight the entire time, and when he woke, the sky was clear. They laughed at that one, the sound rough but warm like the crack of a frozen rope thawing. Between stories came silences, soft ones, not fearful anymore. The sea creaked, the ropes sighed, and every now and then someone coughed, then chuckled at his own misery. The cat purred on a pile of rags, the sound blending with the murmur of voices and the faint rhythmic hum of the hull. Historians who read sailors' journals often skip the pages filled with stories, dismissing them as folklore, nonsense, or superstition. But those pages are the truest. When the cold made thoughts slow, and the night stretched endlessly, stories were heat. Words burned brighter than embers, and belief, even foolish belief, kept men breathing. One pirate with a missing tooth began a tale about a light he'd once seen dancing over the water, green and alive like a spirit. Another interrupted, saying it was the soul of a drowned woman who'd followed her lover to sea. They argued softly about whether ghosts could freeze, whether the sea had a heart, whether God truly bothered with men like them. The arguments never reached answers, but that wasn't the point. The rhythm of talking kept them human. Someone fetched a small drum made from a broken barrel and stretched canvas. Its thump echoed through the cramped space. Steady as a heartbeat, a man began to hum along, an old work tune maybe, or something older still, from a shore no one remembered. Gradually the others joined in. The melody was slow and circular, like the swing of hammocks, looping back on itself, carrying them somewhere between waking and dream. Up above, the sky cleared again. Stars poured across the horizon, bright, innumerable, reflected faintly in the black water. The cold bit sharper now that the wind had died, yet it also carried a strange sweetness, clean and new. The captain stood alone on deck, listening. He could hear the muffled rhythm from below, the voices of his men blending with the heartbeat of the ship. He smiled once, faintly, and tapped the railing with his thumb in time with their song. For the first time in many nights, no one was afraid to sleep. One by one, the men drifted off mid-story, their words fading into quiet breaths. The lantern flickered low. The cat shifted, stretched, and curled again. The sea outside murmured gently against the hull, as if telling its own story back to them. And in that endless cold, surrounded by black water and silence, something almost wholly settled over the ship. A fragile peace that could never be earned by violence, only endured into existence. The pirates slept, their dreams stitched together by song and superstition, their minds adrift on calmer seas than the one beneath them. The cold still ruled, yes, but for tonight it ruled gently. Dawn crept back slowly, almost shy, after so many cruel mornings. The first light came pale and uncertain, like milk poured into ink, spilling across the horizon, until it touched the sails with a faint silver glow. The ship floated quietly now, the sea calm enough to forget the violence of days past. A thin mist lingered just above the waterline, and for a few precious moments everything felt weightless, ship, sea, and sky suspended in the same breath. The pirates stirred one by one, yawning, stretching, blinking at the dim light that seeped through the gaps in the planks. No one rushed to move. They had learned that mornings were fragile things, easily broken by noise or complaint. Instead, they lay still, listening to the steady hum of the ship, wood creaking, water slapping gently against the hull, the low purr of the cat waking somewhere near the galley. When they finally rose, they did so quietly. The cold was still there, coiled like a serpent around their bones, but it no longer frightened them. It was simply part of the ship. Now, a constant companion that demanded respect, not fear. One man rubbed his hands together and smiled faintly when he felt the faint sting of returning warmth. "Still alive," he muttered. And another answered, "A fine start." Up on deck, the air was clear and still. The frost that had gathered overnight shimmered faintly in the new light, and for the first time in weeks the wind didn't cut, it brushed. The men moved about their work without command, checking ropes, scraping ice, and wiping condensation from the small glass of the compass box. There was no hurry, no shouting, just the quiet rhythm of routine, the sound of survival made ordinary. The captain emerged last. His face was pale and drawn, but his eyes were clear again. He stood for a long time at the bow, hands clasped behind his back, watching the line where the mist met the water. Behind him, the men worked without speaking, their movements slow but sure. For the first time since the voyage began, it felt like a crew again, not a collection of desperate men, but something resembling a family, forged by cold, fear, and endurance. Historians like to write about pirates as restless and chaotic, creatures of greed and lawlessness. But the truth, at least on mornings like this, was quieter. These men had learned something the land never taught, that life was not about comfort but continuation. Every dawn was a victory, every calm sea a small miracle. One pirate began to hum a tune, the same wordless song from the night before. Another joined him, and soon the hum spread through the deck, low and warm. It wasn't music exactly, more like breathing set to rhythm, the sound of hearts remembering they were still beating. The captain listened for a moment, then nodded slowly, a gesture of approval that needed no words. When breakfast came, it was as poor as ever, hard bread, salted beef, and the last of the rum watered down to stretch another day. But it tasted different now, better somehow. The men chewed slowly, passing the flask from hand to hand, their laughter soft and real. The cook, still grumbling about his cracked ladle, smiled without realizing it. Even the cat seemed livelier, prowling between the men's boots with her tail high, occasionally rubbing against a leg, as if she too felt the change in the air. By midday, the mist began to lift. The horizon opened wide and clean, showing a thin ribbon of land far in the distance. No one dared name it yet. It could be an island or just a trick of light, but the sight alone brought a surge of quiet energy. Shoulders straightened, eyes sharpened, hearts lifted. The ship creaked with new purpose. A man at the mast shouted something cheerful, and the others laughed. The sound echoed across the open sea, small but defiant. For the first time in weeks it didn't feel like a plea. It felt like life. And as the ship moved forward, its sails thawing in the pale sun, you could almost believe that the worst was behind them. They had slept through cold that could kill, survived storms that could shatter mountains, and still found warmth in the simplest of things, stories, laughter, a shared song in the dark. The pirates didn't call it hope. They didn't have words for that, but they carried it all the same, quietly, stubbornly, like an ember hidden in a pocket, waiting for the next fire. The cat climbed onto the railing, eyes fixed on the faint shape of land ahead. The wind rose just enough to fill the sails, and the ship began to glide forward again, steady and sure. And somewhere deep below, in the wooden heart of that ship, where hammocks still swayed and stories still lingered, you could feel the pulse of something ancient and unbreakable, human endurance against the endless frozen sea. The morning after landfall came quietly, without fanfare. The fire had burned down to a soft pile of grey ash, and the sand around it was patterned with the outlines of sleeping bodies. The tide had crept close during the night, licking at their boots, drawing faint lines through the sand like the signatures of ghosts. Above them, gulls wheeled and called, their cries sharp and alive, cutting through the slow rhythm of the surf. The pirates woke one by one. For a moment, each man seemed confused, reaching for the ceiling that was no longer there, expecting the sway of the ship that no longer rocked them. Then they remembered land, stillness, the smell of pine and salt, not smoke and tar. One man laughed softly, rubbing his eyes. Another cursed out of habit, then smiled in spite of himself. Their faces, drawn and pale, seemed younger in the daylight. They moved stiffly, joints cracking, after too many nights spent in hammocks and frost. The cold still lingered, but it was a different kind now, gentler, touched by the sun. The light spilled across the sand, turning the frost on the rocks into glitter. You could almost believe that the sea, cruel as she was, had given them this morning as an apology. The captain was already awake. He stood near the edge of the water, his coat wrapped tight, watching the ship anchored offshore. In the bright light it looked small, fragile even, a toy caught between worlds. Its reflection quivered in the waves like a memory that didn't quite want to fade. The men joined him silently, following his gaze. "Never thought she'd make it this far," one said. "She didn't, Stet," the captain replied softly. "We did." No one answered. There was no need. They spent the morning tending to their bodies first, washing in the icy shallows, scrubbing salt and grime from their skin, patching wounds they had ignored for weeks. Some had frostbite beginning to blacken their toes, others raw hands split open from rope and cold, yet they laughed through the pain, teasing one another, comparing scars like old comrades. For the first time in months they could see themselves clearly. Later they set about making camp properly. They gathered driftwood, dried kelp, and the sparse branches that clung to the cliffs. Smoke rose again into the sky, but this time it didn't smell of suffering. It smelled of warmth. A man roasted a small fish he had caught near the rocks, and the others crowded close just to watch it cook. They spoke little, but their silence was full, not empty. In the afternoon, when the tide receded, they walked along the shoreline. The cat followed them, weaving between their boots, occasionally darting ahead to chase the foam. They found shells, smooth stones, and bits of sea glass, small, useless things, but precious after so much time surrounded by nothing but ice and death. One man pocketed a piece of green glass, saying he'd keep it as proof that beauty still survived the cold. Historians who read shipwreck accounts often remark that survivors rarely celebrate. They do not dance or cheer. Survival, it seems, is too heavy a gift for joy. The pirates were no different. They didn't sing or shout. They just moved through the quiet day like men relearning what it meant to be alive. Each step left a print in the sand, and for once the ground didn't sway beneath them. As evening came, the captain gathered them near the fire. The light turned gold on their faces, flickering like something sacred. He spoke without raising his voice. "You'll go where you choose now. No one commands you anymore. The sea's had her fill of us." He looked around at them, at the bruises, the hollow eyes, the cracked lips, and for the first time in years he smiled. "If you ever return to her, may she remember this night and be kind." They nodded, one by one, understanding more than his words. For pirates, freedom had always meant the sea. But now, after the endless cold and the long silence of survival, freedom meant something simpler: warmth, stillness, the chance to sleep without fear. That night, as darkness gathered again, they built one last fire, not to fight the cold, but to watch it burn. The flames licked the air softly, throwing sparks toward the stars, the same stars that had guided them through storms and sleepless nights. The ship still floated offshore, its silhouette black against the horizon, rocking gently like a tired heart. The men sat in a circle, saying little, a few shared stories again, half-remembered legends of the frozen sea, tales of ghosts and lights that danced over the waves. Others just listened, eyes half closed, letting the sound of voices and fire weave them into the same quiet peace. When sleep came, it came easily. No fear of freezing, no need for watchmen or ropes, just the slow rhythm of breath and the whisper of waves against the shore. The cat curled near the captain's coat, her tail flicking once before settling. The sea stretched out beyond them, vast and silver beneath the moonlight. Somewhere in that endless cold, their old life drifted away, part of the water now, part of the story that only the ocean would remember. And on the quiet shore, the pirates slept, not as outlaws, not as ghosts, but simply as men who had found their way back to the warmth of the living world. The final morning began with fog. It rolled in from the sea without sound, swallowing the cove in a grey, drifting veil. The air smelled of wet wood and smoke, and the fire they had tended through the night burned low, its coals glowing like the last embers of a dream. The pirates stirred slowly beneath their blankets, blinking into the pale blur that erased the horizon. For a moment it was impossible to tell where the sea ended and the sky began. Both had become the same soft, shifting colour. The captain was already awake. He stood near the water's edge, boots half buried in the sand, the hem of his coat fluttering faintly in the wind. His eyes were on the ship, a ghostly outline now half lost in the mist, floating between worlds like a memory that refused to sink. Behind him the others watched in silence, sensing something final in his stillness. They had spoken little since the night before. There was nothing left to say. Survival has a way of emptying the mouth. Words become small things after so much struggle, yet the air was full of meaning. They knew that this day would be their last together, that once the fog lifted, the paths would split like branches in a forest. Some would go inland toward villages, some toward the distant smoke of settlements, and one or two, perhaps, would follow the coastline until it vanished again into sea and wind. The captain turned at last, his breath white in the morning air. "It's time," he said simply. No speech, no command, just the truth. They rose, gathering their things, a few knives, a coil of rope, scraps of food, pieces of cloth wrapped around their shoulders. None had much to carry. Their wealth had never been gold or silver, but the scars and stories etched into their skin. One by one they came to him, each man touching the captain's shoulder, not as a salute, but as a quiet farewell. The gestures were rough, wordless, and full of something that could not be written down. When the last man stepped back, the captain nodded once and looked toward the ship again. "She will drift," he said. "That sits how it should be." They watched as he waded into the surf, boots filling with water, coat heavy with salt. He didn't look back. The cat meowed softly from the rocks, a sound so small it barely carried over the waves. The fog swallowed him halfway to the boat. Then, as if the sea had waited for this moment, the mist thinned just enough for them to see him climb aboard one final time. The ship rocked once, gently, as though recognizing its captain again. Then it began to drift, slow, deliberate, toward the open water. No sails, no oars, no sound but the steady hiss of the tide. The men stood watching until the ship became nothing but a faint, dark line in the grey. One of them whispered, "He's gone home." Another answered, "We all do, sooner or later." When the fog closed completely, they turned back toward the cliffs, the fire, the waiting land, and the first fragile warmth of a world that no longer needed them to fight for it. The fog began to thin as the day stretched forward, rising in slow curls that revealed the jagged outline of cliffs and the dark shapes of pine trees leaning toward the sea. The men moved inland, following a narrow trail that wound between boulders slick with moss. Each step felt heavier than it should have, their legs accustomed to the shifting rhythm of waves, not the stubborn stillness of soil. The earth resisted them, solid and strange, and they found themselves swaying slightly as they walked, as if their bodies still remembered the ship's endless motion. The sound of their boots on the frozen ground felt foreign, too loud, like intruders in a place untouched by noise. The air was different here, thick with the scent of pine sap and damp stone, and when they breathed it in, they coughed softly as though their lungs had forgotten what clean air was. Behind them, the sea murmured faintly, distant now like an old memory calling from far away. They came upon a stream trickling between rocks, its surface thinly crusted with ice. One man knelt, broke the skin of frost, and cupped the water in his hands. He drank slowly, eyes closed, as if it were the finest rum he'd ever tasted. When he looked up, there was something almost childlike in his expression. "It's sweet," he whispered, as though surprised that water could be anything but salt. The others followed, kneeling in turn, scooping handfuls of the icy flow until their fingers numbed. Historians sometimes write that sailors struggled most with stillness after long voyages. The quiet felt heavier than storms, the ground too certain after months of movement. The pirates felt it now. Each sound, a snapping twig, a bird's distant cry, startled them. They were men who had learned to live by rhythm. The creak of planks, the roll of waves, the moan of wind through ropes. Here there was no rhythm, only the slow, uneven pulse of nature, unconcerned with their presence. As afternoon faded, they reached a small hollow where the forest opened into a sheltered clearing. The light fell golden through the trees, turning the frost on the branches to glitter. One of them whistled softly. "It's quiet," he said, almost in disbelief. Too quiet, but then he smiled. Maybe that's how it's supposed to be. They built another small fire, though the ground fought them, damp earth, reluctant to catch. When the flames finally took, the smoke curled upward into the canopy, carrying the faint smell of salt that still clung to their clothes. They sat close, shoulders touching, eyes half closed, the heat licking their faces. One man began to hum, a low, tuneless sound that echoed faintly between the trees. The others joined in, not quite singing, not quite speaking, just breathing together in rhythm. The melody was wordless but familiar, a blend of all the lullabies the sea had taught them. The cat, who had followed at her own slow pace, curled near the fire, her purring merging with their hum. For a moment they were no longer pirates or outlaws, but men simply learning how to exist in silence again. The fire crackled softly, and the forest answered with its own quiet song, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the drip of thawing frost, the faraway splash of the sea they had left behind. The world felt wider now, infinite in its stillness. As night fell, one of them spoke into the dark, his voice slow and calm. "We used to say the sea owned us," he murmured, "but maybe it just borrowed us for a while." No one replied. There was no need. The fire burned low, and the men drifted into sleep, their dreams filled not with waves this time, but with trees that didn't move, roots that held steady, and the soft, endless hush of land that never sank. Morning came quietly, wrapped in the pale silver of frost and mist. The fire from the night before had died to a thin ring of ash, and the men woke one by one, stretching stiff limbs beneath the tall pines. Above them the branches creaked gently, releasing small flurries of snow that drifted down in slow, weightless spirals. The air was cold but clean, and for the first time in months it didn't smell of salt or decay, only of pine sap, wet bark, and the faint sweetness of frozen earth. They packed what little they had, and followed a faint path deeper into the woods, the cat trotting ahead like a grey shadow. The ground crunched under their boots, and the sound echoed softly between the trees. They spoke little. Speech felt too loud in this kind of stillness. Each man carried the same thought, though none dared say it, that the land itself felt alive, as if watching them, curious to see what they would do next. After an hour of walking, they reached the edge of the forest, where the trees thinned and opened onto a slope that led down toward the coast again. But below, half hidden by mist, lay something unexpected, the outline of houses, small and square, their roofs sagging under the weight of snow. Smoke did not rise from any chimney. No footprints marked the ground. The pirates stopped, exchanging wary glances. "Abandoned," one muttered. "Or dead." They descended slowly, the air thick with the smell of old wood and frozen seaweed. The village looked as if it had been carved out of silence. Doors half open, windows broken, fishing nets hanging stiff and brittle like cobwebs. The sea lay just beyond, a sheet of dull grey ice broken by the faint pulse of the tide. They moved carefully between the houses, their footsteps muffled by frost. In one hut, they found the remains of a hearth, the stones blackened and cold. In another, a wooden table covered with salt stains, a single clay bowl still upright as though waiting for someone to return. Everything was still, frozen midlife. A gull called somewhere distant, the sound hollow as a bell. The cat leapt onto a windowsill and began to purr, pressing its face against the cold glass. One of the men smiled faintly. "She thinks it's home," he said, and his voice broke the silence so suddenly that it startled even him. Historians who studied coastal ruins like these often found traces of sudden flight, overturned stools, scattered tools, empty barrels left open to the rain. It was as if the sea had warned them once, and they had listened too late. The pirates didn't need to read the signs to understand. They'd lived through the same fear. Inside the largest house, the captain's old crew found what little warmth remained. A cot still draped with a wool blanket, a rusted lantern, a wooden chest bound with iron. They opened it carefully, expecting nothing, but inside lay a few ordinary things. A child's shoe, a carved spoon, a small tin cup. The man who opened it touched the shoe with a strange reverence, as though it were treasure. "Someone lived here," he murmured. "Someone like us." They stayed there for the rest of the day, rebuilding the hearth and coaxing a small fire to life. The smoke curled through the cracks in the roof, and for the first time since leaving the ship, the warmth felt different, rooted, unmoving. The men sat in silence, their faces lit by the flicker of flames, the cat curled near the door, tail flicking in slow rhythm. One of them broke the quiet. "We could stay," he said softly. "Fix this place. Fish the coast. Live quiet." The others didn't answer right away. They stared into the fire, each lost in thought. For men who had lived by plunder and wind, the idea of stillness was both comfort and terror. The sea had been cruel, but it had always given them purpose. Land was safer and emptier. As dusk fell, the first snow of the new night began to drift again, soft and silent. The flakes caught the firelight, glowing faintly before melting on the wooden floor. One man reached out, trying to catch one before it vanished. "Warm hands," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I forgot what that feels like." The fire cracked softly, and the wind outside howled through the empty streets like the breath of ghosts. Yet inside the house, there was a calm that none of them had known before, not the restless calm of waiting for a storm, but the steady peace of belonging, if only for a night. And as the men drifted towards sleep, the cat climbed onto the captain's old chair and purred louder, its sound filling the room like a heartbeat. The pirates closed their eyes, and for the first time in a long time, the sea did not follow them into their dreams. By dawn, the snow had deepened, covering the village in a soft white hush. The wind had fallen silent, leaving only the faint sound of the sea beyond the dunes, not crashing or roaring as before, but breathing, slow and patient, like something enormous asleep. The pirates woke to a world remade. The jagged edges of ruin had softened beneath the frost. Broken nets, cracked barrels, shattered windows, all buried under a clean, glimmering skin of ice. The fire in the hearth had gone cold, but a faint warmth still lingered in the stones. The men rose stiffly, pulling on their patched coats, stamping the snow from their boots. The cat stretched near the embers, yawned once, and followed them as they stepped outside into the pale light. It was strange, walking through the village in daylight. The night before it had seemed ghostly, half-imagined. Now it was heart-breakingly real, the remnants of human life still clinging to the walls. Nets hung from wooden posts, frozen mid-sway. A cradle lay tipped on its side beneath a collapsed roof. The door of a small chapel banged softly in the wind, its hinges creaking with every gust. They moved quietly, as if afraid to disturb the place. Every house told a story. In one they found a fishing spear still leaning against the wall. In another, a wooden comb, smooth from years of use. None of it spoke of violence, only absence, like a breath held too long. Historians often wrote about such northern settlements abandoned in the harshest winters, entire villages that vanished between one season and the next. Famine, storms, sickness, the reasons blurred together until the truth dissolved in snow. The pirates didn't have to guess. They had seen the same emptiness in men's eyes before, just before the sea claimed them. Near the edge of the village, one of them called out, "Here," he said, voice low. The others followed and found him kneeling beside a line of wooden stakes half buried in snow. Between them lay shapes, mounds too neat to be random, graves, some marked with crude crosses, others with simple stones carved only with initials or none at all. The men stood in silence. Even the wind seemed to pause. The cat rubbed against one of the markers, then sat still watching the snowdrift. The captain's old first mate crouched and brushed frost from one of the stones. Beneath the thin ice, the carving became visible, a circle with a line through it, the old sailor's sign for safe return. He stared at it for a long time, his breath rising in pale clouds. "They didn't," he whispered. Another man crossed himself. Maybe they thought they would. It was an odd thing to stand among the dead and feel kinship instead of fear. But the pirates understood these people better than they ever could have explained. They too had lived at the edge of the world, fighting the cold, praying for warmth, dreaming of land while surrounded by the sea's endless hunger. The graves were not tragic. They were familiar. They built a small fire near the burial ground, more for respect than for heat. No one spoke. The flames licked at the snow, hissing softly as it melted. The cat curled beside one of the crosses, her tail wrapped tight around her paws. One man reached into his coat and drew out the piece of green sea glass he had found on the shore the day before. He set it gently on one of the graves. "For light," he murmured. Another followed, laying a small carved charm, a bit of driftwood shaped like a fish, for the voyage. One by one the men added what little they had, a button, a coin, a scrap of red cloth, until the mound looked less like death and more like remembrance. When they stepped back, the firelight flickered over the objects, making them gleam like treasures. For a long while, no one moved. The air was so still that they could hear the slow crack of ice shifting on the sea beyond the cliffs. It sounded almost like a sigh. A line from an old mariner's song floated into one man's mind. "The sea forgets no names." He whispered it softly, and the others nodded, recognizing the truth of it. The ocean remembered everything. Every life, every loss, every prayer whispered into the wind. As dusk fell, they returned to the house, the snow crunching beneath their boots. No one spoke of what they had found. They didn't have to. The village had given them something they hadn't known they were missing, the quiet understanding that they were not alone in their endurance, that others had fought the same cold, feared the same silence, and dreamed the same fragile dreams of survival. That night, they slept lighter. The fire burned low, the cat purred beside the hearth, and outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and endless, as if trying to cover the past in peace. And for the first time when they dreamed, the sea did not call them back. It only watched from afar, its song muted beneath the weight of snow and memory. The next morning dawned pale and soundless, the kind of stillness that feels heavy, as if the world itself is holding its breath. The snow had stopped sometime during the night, leaving the village blanketed in a perfect white that gleamed faintly under the first hints of sunlight. Smoke still drifted lazily from the chimney of the house they had claimed, curling into the blue air before disappearing. The pirates rose slowly, their movements quieter now, softened by something gentler than exhaustion. There was peace in their silence, not the wary stillness of men waiting for danger, but the calm of those who have finally made peace with it. Outside, the cat was already prowling along the snowdrifts, her paws leaving small perfect prints that led toward the sea. They followed her eventually, drawn by the familiar sound of water moving beneath ice. The tide had returned during the night, gnawing gently at the frozen edges of the bay. A thin mist clung to the horizon, and far beyond it, the faint outline of the captain's ship still drifted, smaller now, lower in the water, its hull half covered with frost. It looked more like a memory than a vessel. The men stood in a loose line along the shore. No one spoke for a long time. The wind pressed softly at their coats, carrying the salt smell they thought they'd left behind. Finally, one of them said what they had all been thinking. "She sits, still there." Another nodded. Not for long. The ship rocked once, twice, and then a faint cracking sound rolled across the bay, the sound of ice breaking, of wood shifting. The sea was reclaiming what it had lent. They watched as the tide drew her farther out, piece by piece, until only the masts were visible against the sky, black and fragile like the ribs of a great beast sinking into sleep. "She seps going home," one murmured. "Maybe we should too," said another. But that question lingered in the air with no answer. Home meant different things now. By midday they returned to the village and sat together by the fire. The decision came quietly, without argument. Some would stay. The village had good shelter, fish in the shallows, wood for warmth. Life could return here, slow and steady, if someone tended it. Others could not bear the thought. The land was too still, too heavy. The sea had carved its rhythm into their bones, and the silence of soil felt like drowning. One man, the youngest, stood by the window watching the waves beyond the snow. "I still find another ship," he said softly. "Maybe not a pirate one, maybe one that trades. I just can sit end on land." Another chuckled under his breath. "You set or die out there." "Maybe," the younger man said. "But at least it's set'll feel like living." There was no judgment in the room, only understanding. They all knew that rest comes differently to different souls. For some, peace is in stillness. For others, it's in motion. As the afternoon light faded, they began to divide their meager supplies: rope, knives, bits of food, blankets. The ones who stayed packed snow into clay jars to melt later for water. The ones who planned to leave sharpen their blades, their hands steady but eyes distant. When the last preparations were done, they sat together for one final meal. The fire crackled low, throwing long shadows on the walls. The cat curled between them, purring softly. Someone poured a bit of rum, just enough for a sip each. They lifted their cups silently. Not a toast, not a farewell, just an acknowledgement that they had endured. Outside, the sky had turned violet. The first stars blinked through the thinning clouds, and the sea reflected them faintly, like a mirror of the heavens. One of the men looked up and whispered, "She sits calm tonight." Another smiled. "Then we sip been forgiven." The cat stretched and climbed onto the windowsill, watching the twilight spread across the horizon. The men followed her gaze, knowing that tomorrow would scatter them like leaves in the wind, some to rebuild the quiet village, others to follow the call of the sea that had shaped and scarred them both. But for tonight, under the stillness of the northern sky, they were whole. The sea no longer haunted them, the land no longer frightened them, and the silence no longer felt like punishment. It felt like grace. They stayed there until the fire burned low, until the stars shimmered faintly on the snow outside, and the cold crept gently through the cracks like a lullaby. When they finally slept, they did so without fear, dreaming not of storms or ice, but of warmth, steady, quiet, and human. The next morning arrived colourless and slow, the light filtering through a sky heavy with mist. The snow had hardened during the night, and each step across it gave a faint, hollow crunch. The air felt sharper, thinner, as though the world was holding its breath again, waiting for something to end or begin. The sea, stretched out beyond the ice-fringed bay, looked pale and endless, a flat mirror that blurred the line between heaven and water. The men who had chosen to leave moved quietly, their motions unhurried, as though every gesture carried the weight of memory. They had fashioned a small boat from the ship's old lifeboat, patched with tar and ropes scavenged from the village, its sides worn smooth by years of salt and frost. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A final vessel for those who could not stay still. The others stood at the water's edge, their breath fogging in the cold, watching in silence. There were no goodbyes, only nods, the kind that said, "I understand." The sea did not allow for long farewells. It demanded quiet departures. The young man, the one who had said he couldn't end on land, stood at the bow. His face looked different in the morning light. Not defiant, not proud, but strangely peaceful. The cat circled his boots once, then stopped, as if deciding whether to follow. He bent, scratched her head, and whispered something none of the others heard. She blinked slowly, turned away, and walked back toward the fire still smouldering in the distance. They pushed the boat into the water. The ice cracked softly, making a sound like breaking glass. The oars dipped once, twice, and the small craft began to drift forward, gliding into the grey. No one spoke. The rhythm of the oars was steady, each pull carving a thin path through the mirrored surface. The men on the shore watched until the boat became a blur, a moving shadow swallowed by mist. It was impossible to tell how far it had gone, the horizon erased by fog. Only the faint echo of the oars remained. Then even that was gone, replaced by the soft eternal hush of the sea. One of the older men, the one who had found the child Sip's shoe, spoke quietly. He Sip find what he Sip's looking for. Another shook his head. Or what Sep's looking for him. The sea shimmered faintly under the rising sun, its surface catching the light in flashes of silver. For a moment it almost looked warm. They stood there a long while, until the cold began to bite through their coats. Then they turned back toward the village. Life waited, small, fragile, but alive. The hearth needed tending, the fish traps mending, the roof patching. The sea had taken enough. Now the land would keep what remained. Days turned to weeks, and the snow began to thaw. The ice along the shore melted into ribbons of water, and seabirds returned, crying sharp and bright against the soft wind. The men rebuilt what they could. They fixed doors, cleared nets, and carved new oars for boats that might one day sail again. In time, laughter returned too, quiet at first, then steady, carrying over the waves like a song. The cat grew fat and content, sleeping near the fire, watching them as though she were the guardian of their fragile peace. Sometimes, when the mist rolled in thick from the sea, one of the men swore he saw a shape far out on the water, a small boat rocking gently in the fog, a single figure rowing without hurry. They would fall silent then, listening to the waves. Perhaps it was him. Perhaps it was just memory taking form. Either way, they no longer feared it. The sea had ceased to be their enemy. It was simply there, vast, patient, eternal, holding both their past and their forgiveness. On the last night of winter, the sky cleared completely. The northern lights shimmered faintly above the horizon, ribbons of green and gold twisting through the dark. The men stood together outside the house, their breath white against the cold, watching the glow reflect off the sea. For the first time they did not wonder what the lights meant, omen, spirit, or storm. They just watched in silence, feeling small and human beneath the endless sky. And as the wind rose gently from the east, carrying the sound of the waves through the sleeping village, they knew the sea would never truly let them go, nor would they ever truly want it to. It had taken everything from them, and yet, somehow, it had given them back what mattered most, the ability to rest. The cat yawned beside the fire, the aurora rippled above, and the pirates, the last of their kind, closed their eyes at last, letting the rhythm of the sea become their lullaby once more.